I sincerely thank you for joining me today. If you are here to skim for quickly delivered, light on substance content, then you may as well click away now. If, on the other hand, you are here to learn something new, or because you are not satisfied with where science is at with its progress on the many theories of gravity and all of the unsolved paradoxes, then you are in for a real treat. It takes around 30 minutes for me to present this case, and I assure you that if you stay until the end, you may have trouble sleeping tonight, and I'm pretty sure that you won't see the world through the same eyes ever again. The case I am presenting today is exactly as per this title screen. I will reveal the ingeniously engineered way in which nature really keeps her world from flying apart, perpetually and most importantly without energy. Why would nature's way be anything less than optimal and ingenious? Let's proceed, shall we? I also want to make a quick mention now that this is not a religious presentation. In the presentation, I frequently use the term God's eye view, but that is God with a lowercase g, a figure of speech for putting yourself outside and above the system to see what is happening, taking a God's eye view, lowercase g. The presentation is purely scientific. As complicated, paradoxical, and conflicting as we have made the theories of gravity, we certainly didn't and don't need to. Gravity is not a pulling force as proposed by Newton, nor is it the bending of space-time as postulated by Einstein and his relativity. If we make the mistake of looking at gravity from within the system and as part of the system, what our intuitions tell us may be happening may indeed not be happening. Our first introduction to gravity at school does speak of this pulling force as described by Newtonian gravity. We are taught that gravity pulls on us. The bias then becomes confirmed by what we see and feel in the world around us. We cannot dispute that while on the earth we feel weight. Our senses interpret that as a pulling force, that the earth is pulling us towards it. The bias then gets further strengthened by the fact that we see objects fall towards the earth. We think it must be a pulling force pulling objects towards it. It's a very easy trap to fall into. Our biases are then further confirmed when we look at orbits. There must again be this invisible force pulling the moon as if it is attached to a string and holding it in orbit. Now, it is not until the student takes on more advanced physics and studies general relativity that the student is taught then that Santa Claus isn't real. Newtonian gravity is not real. Nothing is pulling. Gravity is not a pulling force. It's the bending of space-time. Of course, only a very tiny percentage of the population study any general relativity, so 99.99% of the world still thinks that gravity is pull. Even the smartest scientists often lapse back to the pull theory in general discussions of gravity. Listen for it, you will hear it. Of course, the pull theory is fraught with paradox. No pulling device is visible, and differing weight objects accelerate at the same rate, which of course defies fundamental laws of motion. And there is no visible force upon those falling objects. On top of that, there is a branch of science still searching for the invisible graviton particle. 90 years later, it still hasn't been found. General relativity then creates a whole new and unique paradigm that arbitrarily introduces the concept of time as a fourth dimension, which results in the bending of warping of the fabric of space and time and ultimately things are being pushed down upon towards the Earth. Orbits are caused by objects resting in a happy place on this fabric at just the perfect angular momentum to keep them in orbit. The problem is, demonstrations of this always seem to show the objects eventually spiraling down and into the body they are orbiting. Why? Because there is no possibility of an eternal energy force to maintain the momentum of the orbiting bodies. You cannot have a force or invisible fabric that keeps an object in orbit without a loss of momentum energy.
Now it orbits. Now it's losing energy, which wouldn't happen in the solar system, right?
Pardon the pun, but general relativity turns out to also be a wild stretch of the imagination. There is no visible evidence of any warping and bending of time and space. It is just mathematical theory. What if, for a moment, we took ourselves out of the system and looked at it from a God's eye view? What would we see? What would we see if we looked from the outside? What keeps objects attached to the Earth? What makes this paradox of objects of differing weight accelerate at the same rate and without any apparent force? What keeps celestial bodies in orbit? Answering these three questions is all we need to answer in order to create an all-encompassing, simple and elegant, just as nature is, answer to the invisible force of gravity. It seems like changing the gravity paradigm to a whole new one of a universal accelerating expansion of all matter does very easily answer the questions that we humans have only been able to explain so far with answers that create paradoxes or with such complexity that the answers don't make basic logical sense. And each time they create a whole new set of unanswerable questions. The dynamic of expansion can actually be greatly leveraged to create geometric effects that answer all of the questions and paradoxes of current theories of gravity. We also begin to see that a lot of what we see is almost illusory. And that is why we are so easily fooled by what we see. Magicians, after all, easily fool their audience. But when the trick is explained, it makes perfect sense, and we do a head slap for not seeing it. Let's take ourselves out of the system and take a God's eye view how things would happen and how would they appear if all matter expanded. Some of the stuff you're about to see will make your spine tingle a little. We will address where this expansion may originate from later. Let's take a God's eye view of why you would feel weight with an accelerating outward expansion of the Earth. Please watch the animation. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? There is no need for an invisible pulling force, And the pushing device we clearly see is the surface of the planet pushing outward, just like an inflating balloon. Now, let's take a God's eye view of why two objects of differing weight would accelerate at the same rate and hit the ground at the same time, regardless of the difference in mass, and also while showing no evidence of any force being applied. Please watch the animation. Again, what you just saw makes perfect sense, doesn't it? The objects themselves are not accelerating. When let go, they remain stationary and suspended in space. The surface of the Earth meets them. It is relative motion, relative acceleration. Einstein called this the equivalence principle. The objects themselves aren't moving, the Earth is. But looking at it from within the system, and as part of the system, we see the items fall. The God's eye view shows us what is really happening. The surface of the Earth expanding towards and meeting the objects at the same time. Would you agree so far that this expansion theory answers the three questions we have posed? Why do we feel a weight force? With the answer being an accelerating, expanding Earth. Why do items of differing weight accelerate at the same rate? With the answer being accelerating, expanding Earth that meets them simultaneously. And how do they even accelerate without any visible force upon them? The answer being relative motion. The objects are stationary and therefore have no force, and it is the Earth accelerating towards them. There is our case made for universal accelerating expansion of all matter being the force of which we call gravity. At least for those particular questions we were asking. Let's now take a look at orbits. Orbits are a real battle for our intuitive senses. I mean, speaking from the point of view of Newtonian gravity, it sure looks like the orbiting bodies are attached to a piece of string and would fly off if the string was cut. General relativity is very paradoxical with explanation of orbits, and that being that visual experiment that you see where they do show a ball orbiting while it is resting upon a fabric and traveling its orbital path. There is no fabric per se in the universe, not one that we have in any way been able to detect. And what then powers this perpetual orbit? Since a force that is acting on a particle in any way, even in a curved invisible space, would lose momentum energy. How can the accelerating expansion of all matter cause celestial bodies to orbit? Let's take a look at an animation of the moon orbiting the Earth. This will be simplified and will be a simple circular orbit for the purpose of the demonstration. This is what we see and know how the moon orbits the Earth. Please watch the animation. The observer on Earth, of course, also sees the moon traveling across the sky from horizon to horizon. Now let's see what the God's eye view shows using the expansion theory of all matter and apply it to the orbit. After we watch the animation, I will explain what is happening. What you just saw is the orbit as it happens with the universal accelerating expansion of all matter. The orbit is not actually real, but a geometric effect, pretty much another optical illusion to the observer on Earth, and that is why we are fooled into believing that the moon is actually orbiting in a true orbit. Let me explain this effect and how it occurs. Consider the moon traveling past the Earth a little faster than the Earth. The moon is obviously also expanding due to the universal expansion of all matter. The speed at which it is traveling, or the relative speed, is at the perfect speed such that the distance between the adjacent surfaces remains a constant fixed ratio of the relative sizes of the planets. In the example animation I showed you, the distance between the two objects between the Earth and the moon is 30 Earth diameters, or approximately 30 Earth diameters. That distance remains constant, not in terms of absolute distance, but in terms of relative distance between the two. So the relative speed of the moon compared to the Earth is perfectly balanced, such that that relative distance remains constant. So in a way, everything is like visually zooming. The entire coupled system is visually zooming. So what does the observer on Earth sees? Exactly what one would see with a classic orbit, and that is a constant size moon moving across the sky. Everything is expanding, but the relative distance is expanding at the same rate and remains exactly the same. So again, what we see from within the system as an observer on Earth is an optical illusion. Celestial bodies in orbit are in an eternal Fibonacci spiral tango, with the orbiting body's relative speed being exactly that speed which enables the relative distance between the adjacent expanding surfaces to remain constant. In this case, that relative distance is 30 Earth diameters, regardless of how big the Earth gets. What is really spooky is the Fibonacci spiral we see. The Fibonacci spiral and the golden ratio is everywhere in nature. We see it also in this geometric effect that is the orbit. This is clearly also by design. This expansion can occur for eternity without the object in orbit ever colliding with the celestial body it is orbiting. Incidentally to this, the moon appears to be a non-rotating body, and that is why we see the same side all of the time. Only seeing one side of the moon is not caused by a center of gravity effect, nor could it be the Googleplex probability that its rotation is exactly its revolution period. What it is that the moon is traveling past the Earth, but it is not rotating. It has no rotation. And so with this geometric effect, the one side of the moon is always facing the Earth. Now, you may say that orbits are elliptical, and that indeed is true. This same principle still applies, and it explains elliptical orbits better than Newtonian or general relativity does. Both of these again are paradoxical. How can Newton's invisible constant force device allow an orbiting body to go farther into the distance and then rubber band back? It is a paradox, and the behavior and the theory are in contradiction. General relativity really has no explanation for elliptical orbits. It borrows from Newtonian gravity. Accelerating expansion elliptical orbits are caused by the fact that orbiting bodies are not spherical. The relative distances between the orbiting non-spherical body causes an equivalent eccentricity of the orbit. The orbit of Jupiter's inner moons have a very low eccentricity because they are almost perfectly spheroid in shape. On the other hand, Halley's Comet, which is shaped like a peanut, has an extremely eccentric orbit. The overall eccentricity of the orbit is a combination of the shapes of the orbiting bodies as well as the plane of the orbit and the ratio of the distances to the facing surfaces, and whether that distance is closing or increasing due to the shape of the facing surfaces. This is what determines the eccentricity of elliptical orbits. In a future video, I will provide the mathematics for this. Also, because the orbit is just a geometric effect, there is no real orbit occurring. There is no loss of momentum caused by the orbit of the orbiting body. Nothing can be held in actual orbit without there being a loss of momentum energy. This is scientific fact. However, since there is no actual orbit occurring and the orbiting bodies are moving in a line in empty space where there is no matter, there is nothing to slow down the object. Newton's first law of motion is every object in a state of uniform motion will remain in that state of motion unless an external force acts upon it. There is nothing in empty space to apply a force to a traveling celestial body, so it will travel for eternity unless an outright collision occurs. No energy is lost to the orbit, and therefore the bodies remain locked in this apparent orbit for eternity. So let's summarize everything I have demonstrated to you today. In conclusion, we see that the expansion of all matter in the universe fully explains, without paradox, the phenomena that make up the behavior we know as gravity. 1. The feeling of weight force caused by outward acceleration of the planet, just like an inflating balloon. 2. Differing weight objects accelerating at the same rate. 3. Acceleration without force, which is caused by relative acceleration. And 4. A full explanation of orbits and orbiting bodies, including eccentricity. This is it. This is gravity. This is the Occam's razor theory that is gravity. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than this. It is a very elegant solution and an example of the perfectly optimal engineering of nature. It leverages the dynamic of expansion, in particularly accelerating expansion, without the need for an eternal power source and without the need to believe in invisible forces and invisible particles or such other non-evident concepts such as the bending and warping of space-time. So you may ask, How is this possible? Well, the math calculates that all matter in the universe is expanding at an accelerating rate of 0.000000077 per second. And this includes you. This expansion is being cloaked from you because you are part of the expanding system. You do not see the expansion per se. You do not see yourself get larger. But you do feel that expansion by the weight force of the earth expanding outward and pushing on you. You also see it with different weight objects accelerating at the same rate. And you also see it in acceleration without force, which is caused by relative acceleration. That is changing the frame. The objects are now the subject that is accelerating. This expansion originates from within the atom. We cannot see this expansion since everything expands, including us. We probably cannot ever detect it with instrumentation, because that instrumentation is subject to the same expanding dynamic. This expansion is perfectly leveraged to create this force we call gravity, without the need for an added mysterious force. As an aside, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a Fibonacci spiral phenomenon occurring within the atom to cause this expansion, but that is only speculation, and a question that really would be a good one for science to answer. I will not try to elaborate any further on this cause of the expansion. The evidence is clearly there that the expansion exists and most likely originates within the atom. And again, to be clear, it is not a uniform expansion, it is an accelerated expansion. Another question you may have is that according to this rate of expansion, in 19 minutes we will have doubled in size, and this time tomorrow we will be 10 to the power of 21 times bigger than we are now. And my answer to that is everything is relative, and so if the universe is infinite, it doesn't matter. And in fact, the universe is the perfect receptacle to expand into. It doesn't matter how big something gets. When it expands into a pool of empty space the size of infinity, it is always going to be infinitesimal compared to infinity. All matter in the universe has been expanding at this rate for 13 billion years. So we couldn't put a number on how much everything has expanded by in that time. But again, relative to infinity, it is still infinitesimal. This is how the expansion dynamic cleverly manifests, by providing the motion of the expansion with the apparent actual expanding motion not actually happening, because it is expanding into an infinite pool of empty space. It is as if the expansion is occurring but not actually occurring, because of the relative size of infinite empty space. Any number is infinitesimal compared to infinity. Therefore, you get the motion, the effect of the motion, the dynamic of the motion, with the increase in size actually being inconsequential. What about dark matter, dark energy, and gravity waves? Well, my answer to that is none of these actually exist. The first two were created as theories because the math doesn't work, and there must be something dark and unidentified to make up the energy shortfall in the mathematical equations. Gravity waves are not real because they don't exist. There is no pulling energy in the universe. there is the optical illusion of pulling force caused by the effects of the accelerating expansion. Gravity waves that were apparently detected turned out to be dust artifact. Black holes are also not what scientists state they are, because there is no pulling force at the center of galaxies, and elsewhere that they are, there is no pulling force that nothing can escape. What may appear to be nothing being able to escape, well, like all things that have been attempted to be explained by gravity, they are not what they seem. I ask mathematicians and theoretical physicists to run your equations again, knowing what you have watched today, and you will indeed see that dark matter and dark energy don't exist, and they don't need to exist. The math now works perfectly. The universe, the space, is a almost perfect vacuum of empty space. No matter, no fabric, no energy, no nothing. It is empty, infinite space. I also invite anyone with the highest credentials to prove what I have presented here today to be factually and logically wrong. Create a video, write a document, or leave a comment. Show me the logical errors I have made. Finally, again, this is it. This is gravity. This is the Occam's razor explanation of a perfectly engineered, elegant solution to this universe we live in. Much of it is optical illusion, the fruit of which are all the wild theories that are theories of gravity today. They are all biased by what we see as part of the system. When you take a God's eye view, take yourself outside of the system and look at it, things are clearly not as they seem. This is the new science of gravity, and this will be the theory of gravity 100 years from now. Beliefs and theory changes only one retirement at a time. I also understand that you might find the concepts presented here hard to swallow. I did too when I first discovered it 15 years ago, and I will admit that it took the first 5 of those 15 years for me to accept it. The more I read and learned about what current science thinks, the more I came to accept this ever so simple and elegant theory of gravity. That caused by accelerating expansion of all matter in the universe, and the leveraging of that dynamic to create a world where everything stays together and behaves predictably. And if you still disagree, who do you think you are to doubt this optimal and elegant solution that nature has engineered to keep everything together? Thank you.